In the last module, we discussed some of the drawbacks of communicating in an indirect way. So that raises the question of why we do it. Because even though there are risks associated with communicating indirectly, we still do it all the time. And hopefully throughout this class, you've been seeing that indirect communication, implicatures, presuppositions, and all of these things are everywhere. We use them all the time. So given that they're risky, why do we do it anyway? And it turns out there are some benefits to communicating in an indirect way. So here are a few of them, and then we'll talk about what they mean. Number one is what you could call creativity, being interesting, being novel, whatever. These are all related, but this is probably one of the biggest benefits of speaking indirectly and in a pragmatic way, that we can make language more interesting. We can say things that are funny. We can say things that are creative. We can convey some kind of profound or deep ideas that are hard to say literally. So the point is that language is much more interesting when we use pragmatics, right? The world would be very boring if everyone just said exactly, literally what they mean. So this is one of the biggest benefits of speaking pragmatically. Another one is being polite. So there are several ways that saying something indirectly can be more polite. And there are some detailed theories of exactly how this works and exactly why indirectness is more polite. But one way that we can think about is that saying something indirectly gives the person that you're speaking to more choices of how they want to reply. So if you ask someone directly to give you something, you're kind of putting them on the spot and forcing them to say yes or no. And that might make everyone feel uncomfortable, especially if they have to say no. But if you say something indirectly, you're kind of giving them the choice of whether to respond to what you're asking directly or to kind of avoid it by addressing the indirect part instead. So for example, there's an example that we discuss more in the online module, but the idea is in this example, there's a guy who kind of wants to ask a girl out, but before asking that directly, he wants to check and see if she has a boyfriend or not. And so he says, do you need to spend time with your boyfriend? So this utterance has a presupposition, right? It presupposes that she has a boyfriend. But instead of just directly asking her, do you have a boyfriend? He instead asks, do you need to spend time with your boyfriend? And then the woman he's talking to has a choice to directly say, no, I don't have a boyfriend, or to just ignore the question entirely. So she just says, no, I don't need to, which could mean that she doesn't have a boyfriend, or it could mean that she does, but she doesn't need to hang out with him. But anyway, she has the opportunity to avoid the question. So sometimes people can use indirect communication as a way to be more polite and give the person more choices of how they'll respond. A related benefit of talking indirectly is it gives you the chance to back out or deny something that you implicated or presupposed or whatever. So if you say something directly, you are kind of committing yourself to that position and saying that you believe that. But if you say something indirectly and then people don't like the thing that you implied or don't like the thing that you suggested, you have a way to kind of back out and say, well, I didn't actually say that. And again, in the online module, we discussed several examples of real world cases where a person has avoided getting into big trouble by saying something indirectly and then denying that that's what they meant. The last benefit that we will discuss of indirect communication is a little bit surprising, but a kind of interesting one. And that is that it turns out saying something indirectly can sometimes make it more persuasive. And the reason for this comes down to a concept called epistemic vigilance. So what epistemic vigilance means is all of us have some kind of mental defense mechanisms that we use to avoid being tricked by people, manipulated by people, and whatever. So we kind of have ways of being skeptical of what people say or of doubting what people say. And in particular, this ability of epistemic vigilance has a few parts to it. So number one, we tend to prefer our own opinions more than others. So we trust our own opinions more than others. Number two, we will trust some idea or some conclusion more if we figured it out ourselves rather than if someone told us. And third of all, we tend to be wary, or we tend to be epistemically vigilant when people are trying to tell us something, especially if it seems like they're trying to tell us something that should change our mind. Right? So what all of these come down to is, we're kind of careful about believing what other people tell us. And we're more willing to believe something if we work it out on our own and we figure out that we should believe it, rather than just trusting what someone tells us. The interesting thing about these is, if you look at these three features, you should see that these are the same features of a lot of pragmatic and indirect communication. So for example, implicatures are things that we have to work out ourselves, right? So a person says something, they say something with some locutionary content or some what is said, and then we go through some extra steps to figure out what the person must have meant. So in this way, we might trust that idea more because we feel like we figured it out ourselves rather than listening to what the person literally told us. So it turns out that if someone implicates something instead of directly telling us, we might believe it more. And in fact, there has been some empirical research on this. So the screenshot I'm showing is the first page of an article describing an experiment where people did exactly this. So in this experiment, the researchers had various volunteers listen to some statements, but in some of the statements, the speaker said something outright, said it literally and explicitly, or in other statements, the speaker implicated it or presupposed it. And what the experiment found was that people trusted speakers more when speakers implicate things instead of saying them literally. So this is another example of a benefit of indirect communication, that people actually sometimes make themselves more persuasive when they imply things pragmatically rather than saying them outright.